Hey there, future policymakers. If
Yeah.
you're gearing up for those UPSC exams, well, let's face it, who isn't these days? You'll want to stick around.
Yeah.
This deep dive is specially made for all of you.
Yeah.
Today, we're tackling a topic that's, well, it's more than just a buzzword, you know.
Mhm.
It could really shake things up in the world of conservation. And trust me, this could be a hot topic in both your mains and prelims.
What I find really interesting is how we're moving past that traditional idea of protected areas,
Oh,
like the national parks and wildlife sanctuaries, those usual suspects. It seems like there's a whole new side to conservation coming out now.
all right, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
So what exactly are we diving into today?
Today, we're going to be exploring what are called other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs for short.
OECMs.
Yeah. And we're going to be using a fantastic report from the IUCN, WCPA, and WWF as our guide.
IUCN, WCPA, WWF. Those names definitely sound familiar. They're pretty much like the big names in conservation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. They are leading the charge on this, and their report, it basically lays out the whole foundation for understanding and implementing OECMs. Think of it like your cheat sheet for navigating this. Well, it's complex, but it's also really fascinating.
Okay, so for our listeners who are just starting their UPSC journey, can you break down what OECMs actually are? What are we talking about here?
In the simplest terms, OECMs are, well, they're areas that might not be officially designated as protected areas,
Hmm.
but they're managed in a way that ends up benefiting biodiversity over the long term.
So not your typical national park then?
Not necessarily. It could be a community forest managed by local villagers, a sacred grove that's protected for religious reasons. It could even be a privately owned farm that's really committed to sustainable practices. The key thing is that these areas, they're contributing to conservation, even if that's not their main objective.
That's interesting. It's almost like we're changing the definition of what conservation can actually look like.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually one of the reasons why OECMs are generating so much excitement in conservation, well, circles, I guess.
Mhm.
They offer a more flexible and inclusive approach, recognizing that conservation can happen in, well, all sorts of ways.
All right, I'm starting to see how this could be relevant for the UPSC exams. I mean, we're always being asked to think about like innovative solutions, and this really seems to fit the bill.
Oh, absolutely. And remember, India's commitment to protecting 30% of its land and water areas by 2030,
Right.
OECMs are a key piece of that.
Okay. So if I'm getting this right, OECMs could really like change the game for hitting India's biodiversity targets.
Yeah,
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go back to the basics.
sure.
Um, the report mentions 5 criteria for identifying an OECM.
Okay.
Can we unpack those a bit?
Of course. So first off, the area can't be a designated protected area already. It has to be something different. Secondly, it can be governed by, well, there are lots of different actors. Think government agencies, local communities, indigenous groups, even private individuals.
So governance isn't like a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
No, not at all.
Okay,
And that's what makes OECMs so adaptable.
gotcha.
The third criteria is that the area may have other objectives besides conservation.
Okay.
So biodiversity conservation might be a happy side effect, but it's not necessarily the main goal.
So it could be like a place used for sustainable farming or even ecotourism.
Exactly, as long as biodiversity is being conserved in the long run. And that brings us to the fourth criteria.
Okay.
The area has to show sustained long-term conservation outcomes. We're not talking about short-term fixes here.
It has to be sustainable and really benefit biodiversity.
Right. And finally, the fifth criteria. This one emphasizes that identifying a site as an OECM is voluntary. No one is forcing this designation. It's about recognizing the conservation value of these places and encouraging their continued management in a way that, well, that benefits biodiversity.
And that makes sense. It seems like that voluntary aspect could be pretty powerful. It's like you're empowering communities and stakeholders to really take ownership of conservation.
Precisely. It's not top-down enforcement. It's about collaborating and recognizing those existing conservation efforts that are already happening, on the ground.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good handle on what OECMs are, but let's switch gears for a second.
All right.
Why are they causing such a stir in the conservation world? What makes them so important in the grand scheme of things?
Well, like we've touched upon, we're facing a global biodiversity crisis, and countries around the world are trying to meet these, well, pretty ambitious conservation targets.
Nice.
OECMs, they provide a way to expand the conservation network beyond those traditional protected areas, bringing in a wider range of landscapes and seascapes under the conservation umbrella.
It's like opening up a whole new way of protecting biodiversity.
Exactly. And this is especially relevant for a megadiverse country like India, where traditional protected areas, well, they might not be enough to cover the full spectrum of biodiversity.
I could already see how this would be like a gold mine for UPSC essays and policy discussions. It's all about thinking outside the box and finding innovative solutions.
You got it. Now, the report, it dives into some fascinating case studies from all around the world. These examples show just how diverse OECMs can be and the range of conservation benefits they can deliver.
Okay, I'm ready for some real-world inspiration. What kind of examples are we talking about?
Well, they highlight places like the Los Amigos Conservation Area in Peru. It's a biodiversity hotspot protecting threatened species like jaguars and giant otters. There's also the Wits Rural Facility in South Africa. It's a research and teaching site that also it kind of serves as a refuge for savanna and grassland species. And then there's the North Tyndall Protected Water Area in Canada. It's a model for how to safeguard freshwater ecosystems.
So we've got rainforests, savannas, and freshwater systems all represented here. It really shows how versatile this concept is.
And here's a thought that might make you want to take some notes for your UPSC prep.
Okay.
India already has potential OECMs all over its, well, diverse landscapes.
Wow.
We just haven't systematically identified and recognized them yet.
Wow, that's huge. Think of all the untapped potential for conservation here.
Yeah.
But I got to ask, how do we tell the difference between OECMs and those protected areas we already know? Like, what are the main differences?
That's a great question, and one that we'll definitely explore more. But for now, let's just say that protected areas, well, those are at the core of conservation efforts.
Yeah.
Think national parks and sanctuaries.
All right.
OECMs, on the other hand, they're like these valuable additions to that core. They expand the conservation network and make it more resilient.
So they complement each other, each playing an important role in the bigger picture of conservation.
Exactly. But hold on to that thought because we're going to dive deeper into how OECMs differ from traditional protected areas and why that distinction is so important right after a short break. Stay tuned.
Okay, so we've established that OECMs are different from those traditional protected areas, but how exactly are they different?
Well, that's where the rubber meets the road, I guess.
Okay.
And it's especially crucial for those of you getting ready for those UPSC exams.
Oh, yeah.
This distinction, it often trips people up, so listen closely.
I'm all ears, and I bet our listeners are too.
So let's start with the most basic difference, the main objective. Protected areas, they're created specifically to conserve nature.
Right, yeah.
That's their whole reason for being.
Okay, that makes sense. National parks, sanctuaries, their main goal is protecting biodiversity.
Exactly. But with OECMs, biodiversity conservation, well, it might not be the primary goal.
Oh, wait.
It could be a secondary outcome, a positive side effect of management practices that are actually focused on something else entirely.
So, for example, a community forest that's managed for sustainable timber harvesting could also be providing valuable habitat for all sorts of different species.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that conservation can happen in places that aren't primarily meant for that purpose.
That's a fascinating nuance. It really challenges how we usually think about what conservation looks like.
Yeah, and that's exactly why it's so important for the UPSC exams. Examiners, they're looking for candidates who can really show, a deep understanding of these evolving concepts.
So it's not just about, memorizing definitions.
Right.
It's about understanding those subtle but crucial differences.
Absolutely. Another key difference is in legal recognition and governance.
Oh.
Protected areas, they're typically established and managed by government agencies, with legal frameworks in place to make sure they're protected.
They've got that official stamp of approval.
Right. But OECMs often fall outside of these formal structures. They might be governed by local communities, indigenous groups, or even private individuals, often through customary practices or voluntary agreements.
So it's a more decentralized and community-driven way of approaching conservation.
Exactly. And this ties into the whole concept of inclusivity, which is a major theme in conservation efforts these days.
This is where that idea of conservation beyond protected areas, it really starts to take shape.
Precisely. And for a country like India, with its, diverse cultural landscapes and rich traditions of community-based natural resource management, OECMs have huge potential.
It's like tapping into this massive network of conservation stewards, people who've been taking care of their lands and waters for generations.
Now let's move on to the role of OECMs in conservation networks. Protected areas, they form the backbone of these networks. But OECMs, they act as crucial connectors and buffers, enhancing their effectiveness and creating a more resilient conservation landscape.
So it's like strengthening the whole conservation fabric, filling in the gaps, and creating a more interconnected system.
Exactly. Think of it like creating corridors for species to move around, buffering protected areas from threats outside, or providing stepping stones for species to disperse in fragmented landscapes.
This is where the strategic importance of OECMs really comes through. They're not just these isolated pockets of conservation. They're part of a larger interconnected system.
And finally, let's think about the conservation outcomes. Protected areas, they're designed to hit specific conservation targets, but OECMs, they might contribute to conservation in more indirect ways.
So their benefits, they might not always be easily measured or even quantifiable, but they're still like making a positive impact.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that cumulative effect of these seemingly small-scale conservation efforts, which can add up to big benefits for biodiversity at a, well, landscape or seascape level.
All right, so we've covered the main differences between OECMs and those protected areas, but I'm curious, how does this all tie into India's specific biodiversity goals? How do OECMs fit into that?
That's a crucial question, especially from a UPSC point of view. Remember that Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or KMGBF, that we talked about before?
Ah, yes, the KMGBF. Another one of those acronyms that every UPSC aspirant needs to know.
Exactly. It's the global roadmap for biodiversity conservation, and India's committed to its ambitious targets.
Right.
And guess what? OECMs, they're specifically recognized in the KMJBF as a vital way to reach those targets.
So it's not just a theoretical concept,
Yeah.
it's part of international conservation agreements.
Absolutely. And for India, this means recognizing and integrating OECMs into national strategies and policies.
Okay, I'm seeing how this could really, like, shake things up for India's conservation efforts. But let's be real, there must be challenges with implementing OECMs on a large scale.
Right. You're absolutely right. There are always challenges when it comes to, turning those ambitious goals into action on the ground.
Right.
And with OECMs, one of the biggest challenges is awareness. Many people, even within the conservation community, they aren't familiar with the concept.
So it's about, like, spreading the word,
Yeah.
educating stakeholders, and building capacity.
Exactly. Another challenge is making sure that OECMs are actually effective at conserving biodiversity.
Right.
We need good monitoring and evaluation systems to track progress and make changes as needed.
So avoiding those quote-unquote paper parks.
Right.
The ones that look good on paper but don't actually do anything for conservation.
Precisely. And lastly, there's the challenge of equity and inclusivity. We need to make sure that the rights and interests of indigenous peoples and local communities are respected and that they benefit from these OECMs.
It's about avoiding those pitfalls of top-down conservation, the kind that exclude or marginalize local communities.
Absolutely. OECMs, they should empower communities, not push them out. And for those of you preparing for the UPSC, think about how these challenges could be tackled through policy or community-based initiatives.
Right.
These are the kinds of questions you might see on your exams.
Okay, so we've explored what OECMs are, how they're different from protected areas, their relevance to India's biodiversity goals, and even some of the challenges with putting them into practice.
Right.
But what about those organizations behind this report? The IUCN, WCPA, and WWF.
Yeah.
What makes them so credible? Why should we care about what they recommend?
That's a great question. And it's important to understand the influence these organizations have in the conservation world. We'll get into that right after we hear from our sponsors.
Okay, so before we took that break, we were talking about the IUCN, WCPA, and WWF. Those organizations behind, the report we're using for this deep dive. Can you tell us a little bit more about their role in conservation?
Yeah, absolutely. These organizations, they're not just tossing around trendy terms, They're really major players in conservation. And
Hmm.
their recommendations, they really carry a lot of weight. It's like they're the expert panel giving advice to governments and organizations on the best ways to protect our planet's biodiversity.
So they're the ones people listen to.
Exactly. For example, take the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. They're probably best known for their red list of threatened species.
Oh, right.
It's
Yeah.
kind of like the barometer for how species are doing globally, a really important tool for figuring out, where to focus conservation efforts.
So they're the ones who tell us which species are in trouble and which ones are doing okay.
Exactly. Then there's the WCPA, the World Commission on Protected Areas. They're a uh, global network of experts focused on, well, protected areas. And their job is to provide guidance on how to manage those areas effectively.
So they're the guardians of those core conservation areas,
Yeah,
the national parks and sanctuaries.
right. And then there's WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature.
Yeah.
Everyone knows them when it comes to conservation. They work on a whole range of issues, from climate change to habitat loss to the illegal wildlife trade.
Yeah, they're the ones with that panda logo, right? I remember seeing their campaigns when I was a kid.
Exactly. The point is, when these three organizations get together to produce a report on OECMs, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
They're bringing all their expertise to the table, and their recommendations, well, they should be taken seriously.
So this isn't just some theoretical thing.
Right.
It has real-world implications for conservation policy.
Absolutely. And for all of you UPSC aspirants out there, understanding the role of these organizations and how they contribute to global conservation, well, it's crucial. It shows a broader awareness of the whole conservation landscape.
It's about understanding the big picture and how everything fits together.
Now, let's shift our focus back to OECMs in action. We've already mentioned a few examples from the report: Los Amigos in Peru, the Wits Rural Facility in South Africa, and North Tyndall in Canada. But let's dig a little deeper into what makes them such compelling examples.
Okay, yeah, I'd love to hear more about how these OECMs actually work in practice.
Well, one of the most striking things about OECMs is their diversity. Just these three examples show how this concept can be applied in different ecosystems with different governance structures and different management goals.
It really challenges that idea that conservation, has to look a certain way or happen in a certain place.
Exactly. Take Los Amigos in Peru, for example. It's a privately owned conservation area that's doing amazing work protecting this huge swath of Amazon rainforest. And it not only has all this incredible biodiversity, but it also gives local communities economic opportunities.
Yeah.
Through sustainable activities like ecotourism and responsible forestry.
So it's a win-win for both conservation and livelihoods.
Exactly. It's a really great example of how private landowners can be, key players in protecting biodiversity.
What about that Wits Rural Facility in South Africa?
Oh, that one's fascinating.
Okay.
Because its main function is actually as a research and teaching facility.
Oh, okay.
But it also protects this large area of savanna and grassland habitat.
Oh, wow.
It's a prime example of how conservation can be, woven into other land uses.
So it's not officially a protected area, but it's still doing a lot for conservation.
Right. And because it's a research facility, they're always collecting data and monitoring biodiversity trends.
Oh, interesting.
Which can then inform, management decisions. And it helps us understand these ecosystems better.
It's like a living laboratory for conservation.
And finally, there's the North Tyndall Protected Water Area in Canada.
Okay.
This one focuses on protecting freshwater resources and aquatic ecosystems. They've got strict land use rules to minimize pollution and protect water quality.
It's a good reminder that OECMs aren't just about those, land-based ecosystems. They can also protect those really important freshwater and marine environments.
Exactly. And what's really interesting about this example is that it's run by a collaborative governance structure.
Okay.
It involves indigenous communities, government agencies, and local stakeholders.
So it's a real partnership for conservation.
Yeah.
Bringing all those different perspectives and expertise together.
Now, with all these inspiring examples from around the world, let's bring it back to India. What's the potential for OECMs in a country as well as diverse and culturally rich as ours?
That's the big question.
Well, as you know, India is what we call a megadiverse country with a huge variety of ecosystems from the Himalayas to the Western Ghats to the Thar Desert.
Right.
And within all these different landscapes, there are tons of areas that could potentially qualify as OECMs.
Like I'm thinking of community forests, sacred groves, wetlands, even those traditional farming systems that have been managed sustainably for generations.
Exactly. India has this, this long history of communities being really central to managing natural resources. And these practices, often rooted in cultural or religious beliefs, they've been protecting biodiversity for centuries without even meaning to.
It's like this hidden network of conservation heroes quietly protecting our natural heritage.
And by recognizing and supporting these existing conservation efforts, we can make them even stronger, integrate them into national strategies, and really unlock their full potential.
It's about um, building on that wisdom and those traditions of local communities and giving them the power to, continue to be stewards of the land.
Precisely. I know this is a lot to take in, especially for those of you studying for the UPSC exams. But remember, OECMs aren't just some abstract concept. They're a real tool for getting conservation results.
And they show a more forward-thinking approach to conservation, one that recognizes how important inclusivity is and community engagement and, innovative solutions.
Exactly. So as you keep going on your UPSC journey, keep those OECMs in mind. They're a crucial part of achieving India's ambitious biodiversity targets. And if you want to, dig even deeper into this topic, make sure to check out that full IUCN report. We'll put a link to it in the show notes.
Great advice. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this deep dive with your fellow UPSC aspirants. Sharing knowledge, well, it's like multiplying it.
Absolutely. And with that, we'll leave you with this final thought. As you explore those potential career paths, whether it's in policy, research, or hands-on conservation, remember that OECMs, they represent a real shift in how we think about protecting biodiversity. Embrace this new way of thinking, challenge those traditional approaches, and see what potential OECMs have to create a more sustainable and biodiverse future for India and the world.
That's a powerful message to end on. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.